Tonight is the seventh in the series of programs sponsored by Esalen Institute on the value of psychotic experience. Tonight's presentation is entitled The Poetry of Madness. The people up here are, on my right, Dr. John Perry, San Francisco psychiatrist, Dr. Claudio Naranjo, a Chilean psychiatrist. My name is Julian Silverman. I'm a research psychologist. This is Allen Ginsberg. Need more be said. Alan Watts. Need more be said. We are going to explore tonight the poetic aspects of what we tried to do last night in the name of science, but which were limited by the necessity of being very analytic and rational and sometimes oversensible. What we are seeking to understand is the sense in the non-rational, the wisdom in the union of opposites, and the reasonableness of the term losing your mind to come to your senses. John, would you please?
I think it wouldn't be right to start the evening's discussion without reference to the man who first went into this question some thousands of years ago, Plato, who was the first of our great psychologists. He had a good deal to say about madness and the absolute necessity of madness in creative thinking and in the enlarging of awareness. He said, in proportion as prophecy is higher and more perfect than divination, both in name and reality, in the same proportion is madness superior to the sane mind, for the one is only of human, but the other of divine origin. Again, where woes have bred in a race, owing to some ancient wrath, their madness, lifting up her voice and flying to prayers and rites, has come to the rescue of those in need. He who has part in this gift and is truly possessed and duly out of his mind is by the use of purifications and mysteries made whole and delivered from evil, future as well as present.
Sir, can your discourse be heard?
Can it be heard?
If you pull the microphone closer, perhaps.
Closer. Is that a little bit better? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, it was Plato talking. And there is a third kind of madness, which is a possession of the muses. This enters into a delicate and virgin soul, and their inspiring frenzy awakens lyric. But he who, not being inspired and having no touch of madness in his soul, comes to the door and thinks that he will get into the temple by the help of art, he, I say, and his poetry are not admitted. The sane man is nowhere at all when he enters into rivalry with the madman. Now this question for Esalen's whole month of seminars has been this of the nature of madness. What is it? Especially with the extreme form of it in schizophrenia. Do we have any right any longer to think of this syndrome as a mere mental disease or an illness? What do we make of the fact that some people actually emerge better in the sense that they are deepened, their awareness is more profound, and they have a quickened capacity for depth in concerns and their callings and their relationships? Or, on the other hand, what do we make of the fact that while mad, patients have experiences, some of beauty, some of terror, but always with the implications of awesomeness and depth? Then there are those who emerge up from madness, back into the normal ego, so-called, who shut the trap door after them and close out their soul at once and become prosaic in the extreme and bland and shallow. What goes wrong when a patient is a visionary looking into the heart of the cosmos and into the heart of his fellow beings, only when he's sick, and is blind and constricted and timid, understanding nothing when he's well, and dependent for the rest of his days perhaps on some drug to keep his soul safely asleep and suppressed. It does sound as if there may be two kinds of madness. There's one of ecstasy and terror, of the bewildering encounter with the spiritual and demonic powers. Then there's the other kind of bland impoverishment and constriction, in which the conventions and the concreteness of the mundane world are taken to be reality. The fact of the matter is, in all of us, about a half an inch below consciousness, we have this madness in us. We drop into quite another state of being, with an altogether different view of the world, an altogether different way of growing emotionally to meet it. And that state of being and that world, since it experiences itself in images and symbols and metaphor and in myth, is considered mad, and we banish it. And we're very fussy about allowing it to appear only on certain terms, our terms. Think how it would appear if I told any of you I died last night, and we're all at the center of the world, and I see the world divided into a cataclysmic clash of forces of good and evil, a world riven in the middle. You take me for mad and pick up the nearest telephone and send me off to have this thing well squashed out of me and stamp out this wildness. I have only to say, I dreamed last night that I died and that the world is in a conflagration, and we could laugh nervously about it, and this would be all right. This is quite acceptable. Or if I came back radiantly from a Sunday revival and talked about experiencing this death on the cross with Jesus, you would perhaps nod understandingly and decline nevertheless to go along with me on this particular trip. If I were being really strategic, I could put it down in rhymed couplets, and this would be quite all right, because poetry is expected to delve into this kind of madness, and that's fine. In our dreams, our religion, our poetic moments, regardless of our intellectual or our philosophical biases and our tenets, we all do have this madness in us. Dreams, after all, do shocking things. We hallucinate people, we hear voices, we believe ourselves to be in any part of the cosmos, we mix the past and the future, the dead come to life and we die and we live again. All manner of irrational happenings go on, especially when the dreams are symbolic and mythological. Is this the case? They're considered nonsensical, and the world at large puts them away as being worthless. On the other hand, in psychotherapy, as you know, it's the surest guide to the meaning of what's going on. Now, this non-rational psyche below the surface that thinks in symbolic images is the emotional psyche. Every emotion has its image which describes its meaning, or you could say every meaning described by such an image is given its dynamism by the emotion. The way we read our world emotionally is in terms of these images, these irrational, mad ways of putting things. And also our emotional psyche grows, not in the usual step-by-step, linear, constant way of development, but in unfamiliar terms, in cataclysmic leaps ahead and regressions backward, deaths and new beginnings, clashes of opposites and violence between them, and then resolutions. So we live in two dimensions of understanding. One, the ego's knowledge, the mundane ways of handling a mundane reality. The other, a knowing in depth, which we call wisdom, in metaphor and image, intimations of meanings, And this is the passional world, our emotional involvements with things in the world which are not yet quite clear, not yet quite understood.
Jai Ram.
Good. This latter is the world into which one plummets when seized with madness. It might be a great love experience, it might be the inspiration of the artist, it might be the deep revelation in a mystical moment, or it might be a schizophrenic episode. Now, what does this one look like? And this is my job, I think, this evening, to give a little bit of a picture of what the schizophrenic kind of madness looks like. The patient lives at a level quite different from surroundings. He lives down inside. He feels isolated there because there's no understanding on the part of his world around for his experience. He has a fear of being overwhelmed by this inner life, but even more a panic at the isolation that he drops into. And this wave of panic sends him into an acute withdrawal. The objects around him lose their color, lose their separateness. They blend into a large indifference. He feels quite indifferent about the world that we live in, and he is located somewhere else. His emotions do not connect in the ordinary way with ordinary things, but his emotions are now concerned with his myth world, and that's his entire concern at the time. He's in a syndrome that can be described not in terms of Kreplinian diagnosis or in terms of clinical description, but in terms of the imagery that he's dropped into. He lives in a world of fragments of myth. They're broken, they come by as wisps of parcels of myth, like a kaleidoscope that's always revolving around a center, and if you tune in on this, you find yourself being able to put this picture together again in a rather consistent sort of way. His world is almost unrecognizable to us. He's at an axis which is the center of a world, something we don't know anything about, a cosmic axis in which powerful events are taking place. There's a death of his old self. He feels he's died on admission to the hospital usually, and that he's living in an afterlife state. He's experiencing a tremendous clash of world powers, powers of light and dark, order and chaos, good and evil, and he is at the center, and they're both closing in on him. He's thrown back in time to the creation of the cosmos, participates that in the world beginnings, and repeats step by step the evolution of creation. He's raised up into a position of supremacy in the world, either in rulership or spiritual leadership or some sort of very particular supreme role. Then, along with the idea of being married to some divine personage, he experiences a new birth or perhaps his own rebirth, and along with this, a wonderfully peaceful resolving of conflicts. He sees a world that's ordered symmetrically in 4 quadrants. These might be continents or political powers or races or creeds, whatever, but at least structured in this way around a cosmic center. And by this time, when he's resolving his conflict, he's stepped out of this central position and is a normal ego standing aside and seeing that this is an integration of his spiritual world. Now, is all that gibberish? Are they distortions? Are they primary process, so-called, an archaic mode, which comes up to the surface only when the ego abdicates? Is it his thinking gone berserk, in which it's nothing but distorted confusions? Is it of any use in the modern mind that this process should be going on? Well, we get a clue to it in the fact that this very process is about 5,000 years old. This is well known in archaic myth and ritual. It is the main outline of the chief religious rites of early societies, early urban societies, which also had a recreation of the world at the renewal of the year, the renewal of the kingship. And each element of this process finds its due place exactly as it does in these patients. So we can't brush it aside as being just a gobbledygook. Not only that, but the patients are strangely similar to one another, which must indicate that there is some process going on that has an outline and a meaning. Now, I would suggest that this process clearly emerges as the psyche's way of dissolving an old state of being, very creatively bringing to birth a new start, with a vision of a new self, with a new potential, with a vision of a new design of life, and a new meaning in one's world, if it goes right. Meanwhile, there's tremendous distress, tremendous cataclysmic, not only isolation, but a crashing down and falling apart of the world that one has known, which is very agonizing. So to come through to this fruitful outcome is a considerable work. It looks as though the real pathology is not then in the images, in the symbolic process. The madness is not a disorder at this level. It looks rather as if the disorder is in the constricted ego that has been educated out of this kind of contact, out of contact with the natural things of the psyche. The need of such a person is to learn to perceive the world symbolically, to experience it symbolically, and thus keep connected with his emotions and to live indeed in an impassioned world. Now, I think as time goes on, I'll be able to illustrate this with some experience of a case in which you can get some of the flavor of the kind of poetic quality of such an experience, but I don't think I should talk that long right now.
Or are you still cogitating?
There is something in common in poetry and in music, in a certain way that both of them are the language of madness, which is to say that the poet and the musician together speak a natural and universal language which Jakob Boehme referred to as the original language that all creatures spoke before the fall of man. For in the Garden of Eden, before Adam and Eve had eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they understood the language of all the animals and spoke such a language themselves, which was the divine language from the beginning. This language is, of course, the language of the birds. And what does it mean? What does the shape of a tree mean? What do clouds mean? What is the meaning of the letters that you could make out in the patterns of foam on breaking waves? What is the meaning of the way the stars are scattered through the sky? Of course, we've tried to make sense of the stars, to project upon this scattering mythological forms as we see in the Big Dipper, a dipper or a plow. But actually, music might express the arrangement of those stars more correctly. Do, 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 do. And what would that be saying? What is Bach saying? What's the meaning of that? And when a tree grows, you know, it goes kind of... And then after that it does... And we say, oh, isn't that beautiful? So much so that an artist can copy it and say, why, it's a picture. And when artists have copied trees and the forms of mountains and clouds long enough, why, in every state park, there's a place called Inspiration Point, where all the tourists come and look at the view, and they say, oh, it's just like a picture. Because you see, both poetry and music lead us to the understanding of what this world is all about, which is that it isn't about anything else. You see, the finest music in both the Eastern and the Western traditions is not descriptive music. It is not music which is to be understood in terms of something other than music. You are not expected in Hindu rags to listen for the sound of the rain on the roof, the sound of the galloping of horses, the sound of the murmuring of the sea. You are listening solely to arabesques of the highest complexity, of rhythm playing with rhythm. Things like that. And exactly the same way in our own great musicians of the West, the same game is being played. And if this has any meaning at all, it is merely to draw our attention to the fact that the entire physical universe is doing just the same thing. We always, of course, like to find an explanation for what's going on. We say that butterflies have great big eyes on their wings to scare off birds, so that they'll think something rather dangerous is looking at them. Or that a centipede has 100 legs, so that it can get along better than an insect with only 6, or a humanoid with only 2. We always find a way of explaining nature in terms of kind of social engineering, that it has a purpose, and that purpose is, of course, survival. There are 2 schools of thought about this fundamentally. The school of thought about the meaning of life, which is most widely acknowledged in the West today, is that the ultimate goal of physical effort is to survive. It was held in medieval times that the ultimate goal of life was the vision of God. That in the end of Dante's Paradiso, we come to the vision of the love that moves the sun and other stars. But when Dante saw this vision, he made the comment that the angels that were surrounding the vision and singing songs made a sound which he compared to the laughter of the universe, because they were singing the word Alleluia, 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 Alleluia. And what does that mean? Alleluia. It's like Hare Krishna. You know, when you say it enough, what a funny sound. Hare Krishna. You can go on, Krishna, 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 or Ram, 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 Ram. What does that mean? Something like that. Because you see, what we're involved in, fundamentally in this cosmos, is a dance, a rhythm. Whether you want to express it through the mode of music, or whether you want to express it in a poetic mood by making words play at being something more than words, more than mere sign indicators, because in poetry the form of words is itself the thing to hear, not simply what it means, because then you could write prose. So both these arts are awakening us to the fact that our own physical organism, for instance, which we think, what do I mean, as if I were just a word, but your own physical organism with its marvelous hair, with its two jewels, the deep eyes, and its breathing apparatus, its kissing apparatus, its eating apparatus, all this, is a kind of fundamental jazz, which just as the tree was going and we're going like this, you see. Just as the stars are shaped in that way. And as the goal of music is not the end, the finale, but all the going along of it, so in exactly the same way, the goal of existence isn't sensible, doesn't have a point, isn't serious. It's not some real reason why all this had to happen. Why do the angels play harps? What is the harp of the angels? If you look at a harp, you see many, many strings, often differently colored. And so in this universe, there are many, many vibrations possible, as the difference between cosmic rays, X-rays, gamma rays, ultraviolet rays, red rays, etc., all the way along, or the different wavelengths of different sounds, the different wavelengths of different radio broadcasts. They all are the strings on the harps of the angels. And the angels say, now, which strings shall we pluck today and call into being this kind of universe, this kind of universe, this kind of universe. And let's play with the harp with the strings not only go this way, but they also go this way. And then we'll slide strings that way through them and strings that way through them. And so have many dimensions upon which everything can happen. For why? If you have to ask why, you're not listening. If you are listening, you dance with it. You don't ask why. And then, you say, well, what's the point of telling you all that? That all this that we are doing, that we are, is just some kind of a chicky-boom, 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 chicky-boom. What's the point of saying that? Why do you have to have a point? If you must, I can say, well, if you get with that, you'll keep out of trouble. Because all the trouble is made by people trying to arrange the world, to make it purposive, to improve it, to make everybody serious, to get with that thing. They're the troublemakers. Tantum religio potuit suadere malorum. Too much religion is apt to encourage evil. Good night.
There's a paragraph of Kafka that I would like to quote exactly, but I read it several years ago. I couldn't find it during the day today. But it says something like, the people who live on the slopes of Mount Sinai speak awkwardly and don't have fluent speech, and they walk awkwardly. They have no poise. And I think this is a useful way to look at psychosis, especially in a day like this. There's something about psychotic experience which is like the breaking, the crumbling under the weight of seeing too much. Dr. Perry has been telling us of this archetypal content, this common voice of man that the psychotic seems to be expressing through times, which comes up again and again, not only through his vision, but it has existed, has been projected as symbols, as myths throughout history. But the way the psychotic expresses this visionary world, the way that comes up is such that only people like Dr. Perry can understand it and present it to us in such a coherent way. And that's a difference between the psychotic and the poet or the myth maker. This content is the same, but I would say the psychotic is a stutterer. He's trying to utter transcendental truths, but in a way that doesn't come across. And that's part of why he's put in asylums and nut houses. Part of the gap in communication lies in how little we are in touch in the kind of world he's living in. But part is in his own difficulty, in his more than that, in that he's at the same time trying to express something and trying to hide it. He's like the Rumpelstiltskin in one Grimm's fairy tales that would come at night and do his work, but whenever and challenge others to know his name, but whenever somebody did find his name and name him, he stamped the ground and split in two. So there is something very much in common between the artist whose profession, whose vocation is to express a truth, and the psychotic. But I think it would be very worthwhile to see what happens in this process that makes a person specifically not an artist, but go into this different condition. Now, we know all the ways that have been shown or prescribed to lead to the way of human integration or greater wholeness, speak of dangers, speak of this phenomenon we're talking about, psychotic, as a possible danger in the way. He speaks of this danger of Persephone, of being imprisoned during the journey to the netherworld. Even Maslow in recent days is talking of the dangers of be-cognition, as he says, being cognition, peak experiences. And not only is this pitfall talked about in the formalized itineraries for human development, but it happens spontaneously. Men who are in the great quest, especially artists, every now and then fall into this. Schumann, for instance, maybe an example towards the end of his life, 40s, is an uncommon age for schizophrenia, but it seems to be the kind of schizophrenia that occurs on people that are, in a way, looking for it, trying to break down the wall to the other side of existence. Hölderlin may be an instance of the same. So, and some of these are really accidents with no recovery. Part of this, as many throughout this SLN endeavor have been pointing out, that this is largely due to the cultural context in which these experiences have taken place. The incarceration policy towards the psychotic. Otherwise, Schumann, for instance, was living in a world where every musical note was an angel, and he lived among angels and conversed with them and did not communicate with other people. He had nothing to say, it seems, but was quite harmless and probably a different environment might have led to a different resolution of whatever he was in. And reasons to believe that this is so are the successful trips, well, they're quite rare. Mysticism could be that of the Ramakrishna, or people who are not seeking in this kind of way, like Swedenborg. He was a scientist before his great experience. He was, in fact, this is little known, but one of the most universal minds that have existed, probably. And through the process of his writing and trying to understand and build up an edifice of all the knowledge available to his time, and the process of deepening of his own understanding, he came to the first experience of contact with his own voices, which became angels and showed him the other world, and that brought about the change in his interest from science to, however it's called, formerly theology, but it was an endeavor in finding what the truth about everything is. Now, in our culture, these instances are very rare. In other cultures are more the rule than the exception. I'm referring here specifically to shamanism, as Dr. Silverman did yesterday. The shaman is typically a man who goes through a crisis that may take the form of what we would call psychosis or not. And he lives in cultures where everybody has the right to be crazy. They know the difference, but everybody has the right to be anyhow. And more often than not, these experiences are valued and looked at with awe and with some expectation. And the person undergoing them is encouraged to stay with whatever it is. And it seems that with psychosis, as with other ills or apparent ills, the statement of homeopathy is valid. Similia similibus curantur. The similar cures the similar. To cure psychosis, what you need is more psychosis. To get rid of a delusion, for instance, what you need is really pay attention to that delusion and see and take more its side rather than battle it. And so shaman in these cultures typically becomes well, we've looked at shamans, the anthropologist stereotype for a shaman as a medicine man, but this is forgetting that the shaman is the original artist too. More often than not, a shaman is an accomplished dancer, a magnificent dramatist, a poet. He's an inspired man that speaks through all the possibilities he has available. And there's increasing evidence that the prehistoric cave paintings, the earliest art, plastic art in humanity, is a shamanistic, specifically shamanistic form of expression and activity. So putting this together, it would seem that we have these two extremes, that the psychotic and the artist, that have a resemblance in that both are a nakedness, an existence, a contact with the inner world, as we don't have ordinarily, but judged from another point of view, are as opposite as they can be. We might also think of a continuum, a range of experience, on one end of which is psychotic experience, then come us normals that are masked psychotics that have chosen not to be in touch with this distressing field of experience, and therefore can go about our business without much suffering and without stuttering like those people who live in the slopes of Mount Sinai. And then on the other end, the artist was the man who doesn't have to cover up his psychosis because he has learned how to deal with it. He's not swallowed by a psychotic experience, but can be voluntary psychotic and move in and out, not only by periods, but in a simultaneous way. This, I don't know how much sense it makes to state these things as generalities, because the proof is in the illustration. Maybe during the talking that we'll have after this, there'll be occasion for that. But I'd like to bring at one point of illustration. It's the most typical of psychotic delusions. Is the most common pathology of thought is that of paranoid thoughts, paranoid thinking. In the most typically psychotic form of expression, paranoia may manifest itself in the belief that a person holds of being persecuted by there might be a confabulation and different planets are involved, and the person is absurd from other worlds, and his thoughts are being read by hidden persecutors. Or and the people in our mental hospitals in Chile at the time I was in medical school had the more popular persecution delusions were about the Jesuits being the persecutors, and the Jesuits having this confabulation. The content can change, but it's something like this. Now, that's the psychotic end. What about normal neurotics, let's say? I would say we behave in paranoid ways, but we don't hold these clear-cut beliefs about why we shy away from certain things or people. But we are quite distrustful after all. But we don't give in either to the full forcefulness of our hidden persecutory feelings. We reason and say, no, this can't be so, this is a good guy, I'll be friends with him, and so on. And only in our dreams we may dream that people are running after us and will kill us, and so on. Then the more normal a person gets, and by normal I mean statistically normal or normatively normal, according to social injunctions of what the way to be is, the more a person has to suppress completely this. Dreams, our culture doesn't mess up with dreams, so we always have this door, but in probably the paranoid quality of life wears away, and the paranoid part of experience is suppressed. Now, if we start going on the other side of the range towards the more extraordinary abnormalities, we get the exceptional psychotics or the borderline psychotics that become famous, like Wilhelm Reich, for instance. And we can, speaking of paranoid tendency, I could quote, cite his book, perhaps you know, The Murder of Christ, and he puts forward in a very forceful and convincing manner how we are killing truth in every minute, and how the historical person, Jesus, was killed by the same, as a result of the same emotional plague we're all in, consisting in the fact that we can't face life, civilization is an anti-life force, and so on. And this is stated in a way that I think didn't get him into trouble till the very end of his life, and maybe even today opinions are divided, was he psychotic or not. Or Rousseau, Henri Rousseau, again we see the same trend of thought, but I haven't heard anybody label his philosophy a paranoid delusion in his stressing the ills of civilization and underlining the goodness of the life closer to nature and the primitivity and so on. So here we have the same thoughts, but expressed in a way that reaches better and we can empathize better with. And if perhaps to the extreme of the range we can find the same thoughts again. For instance, in every tragedy is the source of all drama, I think, and you have in every tragedy the good ones and the bad ones, and specifically the good one, the hero, and we all identify with the hero who eventually gets killed. And here we see the enactment of the same thing, the same picture of the world that the paranoids are presenting us, that the evil wins and the most valuable part of ourselves, the part that can identify with embodiment of goodness, is suffering, is always undergoing this tragedy, which we don't allow ourselves to take sides with and responsibility for, but we enjoy it projected out there in the tragedies some artists make up for us. Now, the origin of tragedy in Greece was based on the cult of Dionysus, and the story of Dionysus is like the archetype of tragedy. He was persecuted since he was born. He was Zeus's wife was very jealous about this infidelity of Zeus and wanted to kill him right away, so he was hidden by Hermes in the forest and till he grew up. But once he was out of the forest and started his mission again, the persecution went on, and the myth is full of the allusion of the killing and the eating up of. The ritual is that of the eating up of an animals that personify Dionysus. The same motive in all, in so many religions, of eating the Godhead, and an act which is an act of love, and at the same time the greatest of all crimes. In the history of tragedy in more modern times, we see the motive starting again from the crucifixion through the mystery plays in the Middle Ages to the more elaborate forms of our days. So what is it all about? It's all about the notion that the world is wrong and goodness is being smashed every moment. And this is talking to some part of our feelings that with which our minds usually don't go along with, but we just call it art, and everything goes in art, and art talks to our unconscious. Now, the psychotic is somebody who says, no, art is not just a luxury or pleasure. He really sinks into the meaning, into the feelings involved here, and it's not so easy to handle this when it becomes more than a play with symbols that are out there and are not us. So, in a way, the artist has a great medium to cope with this tremendum that the psychotic is lost in, and this medium is the medium of symbols. And symbols can serve to express, but also to create a distance and say, it's not me, it's that over there. And perhaps this is why mystics, not only mystics, some very men that knew about the content of all this, sometimes have had some disregard of art. For instance, Kierkegaard, he thinks of the aesthetic dimension as a substitute for the ethic with which he is concerned. The aesthetic is still playing around, playing it out there. And many mystics have been remarkably uninterested in the world of symbols, and claiming that this is only a pale shadow of the reality. Yet, in actual practice, probably the artist, the accomplished, the great true artist, which is probably a minority among artists, is also a man that is conveying the same kind of truths and same contents.
Allen Ginsberg, it has been said that at least certain kinds of inspired schizophrenics and poets are in touch with the same things, except the psychotic makes a bigger pest of himself. What do you have to say about that?
I would like to present some symbols. For the goddess or bodhisattva compassion, the Sutra Enmei Juku Kanon Yo. Kanze o namo butsu yo butsu in yo butsu en bupo so en jorako gajo chonen kanze on bonen kanze on nen jushin ki nen furishin. Kanze o namo butsu yo butsu in yo butsu en bupo so en jorako gajo chonen kanze on bonen kanze on nen jushin ki nen furijin. Kanze on namo butsu yo butsu in yo butsu en bupo so en jorako gajo chonen kanze on bonen kanze on nen jushin ki nen furijin. Kanze on namo butsu yo butsu in yo butsu en bupo so en jorako gajo chonen kanze on bonen kanze on nen jushin ki nen furijin. Kanze on namo butsu yo butsu en bupo so en jorako gajo chonen kanze on bonen kanze on nen jushin ki nen furijin. Kanze on namo butsu yo butsu en bupo so en jorako gajo chonen kanze on bonen kanze on nen jushin ki nen furijin. What are you doing, eccentric, solitary, in this longshoreman's hall? Mad, vagrant, creep, truth cloud, sans identity cards? It's San Francisco, all right. Anyway, the people disappeared. Downtown Longshoreman's Hall branch office for the Chamber of Commerce runs the street light all through dark winter rained by UNIVAC, piped from the Washington lobby. They've abolished the streets from the universe. Just keep control of the lights in case of ectoplasm trafficking through the dead market. Where the Chinese restaurant used to play Muzak in the early century. Soft green rugs, pastel walls, perfumed tea. Goodbye, said the metal announcer in the doors of the Chamber of Commerce. We're merging with NAM forever. And the NAM has no door but sealed copper, 10-foot vault under the Federal Reserve building. 6 billionaires that control America are playing Scrabble with antique tarot. They've just unearthed another pyramid in the bomb-proof cellar at Fort Knox. Not even the FBI knows who. They give orders to J.E. Hoover through the metal phone girl at the robot transmitter on top of RCA. You can see the new Fortune officers with their eyeglasses and gold skulls, silver teeth flashing up their shit-mouthed grin, weeping in their martinis. There is no secret to the success of the 6 billionaires that own all time since the Gnostic revolt in Egypto. They built the Sphinx to confuse my sex life. Who fucked the void? Why are they starting that war all over again in Laos over neutral mind? Is the United States CIA Army overthrowing somebody like Angelica Balabanov again? 6,000 movie theaters, 100 million television sets, 1 billion radios, wires and wireless crisscrossing the hemispheres, semaphore lights and Morse, all telephones ringing at once to connect every mind by its ears to one vast consciousness. This time apocalypse. Everybody waiting for one mind to break through. Man prophet with 2 eyes dare all creation with his dying tongue and say, I am. Messiah swallow back his death into his stomach, gaze through the great pupils of his body's eyes, and look in each eye man, that eyeglass, fearful, myriad look that might be God's eye, see through death, that now are Clark and ego and psychiatrist reading man law. Write newspapers with broadcasts to cover their fears that their own Messiah must come when all of us conscious at once break through to all other consciousness to say the word, I am, as spoken by a certain God, millennia new, and waited till this 1 century. Now all sentience broods and listens, contemplative and hair full of rain, for 15 years inside New York and San Francisco, what millions know and hark to hear, and death will tell, but many strange magicians in buildings listening inside their own heads, or clouds over Manhattan Bridge, or strained through music, messages come to I am from the central one. Come, blow the cosmic horn and waken every Tyglon and clown sentience throughout the vasting circus. In the name of God, pick up the microphone, call networks announcing suchness that I am, mutter 1 million old gods in their beards that had been sleeping at evening radios, talking to myself again, cackling in their own larynx, said the Messiah, turning a dial to remember his last broadcast. I scare myself, I eat my hand, I swallow my own head, I stink in the inevitable bathroom of death this being requires. Oh, widen the area of consciousness. Oh, set my throne in space. I rise to sit in the midst of the starry visible, calling all beings. In dirt from the ant to the most frightened prophet that ever clomb towered a vision planets crowded in one vast spaceship headed toward Andromeda, that all lone soul in Iowa or Harkland joined the lone, set forth, walk naked like a Hebrew king, enter the human city, then speak free. At last the man-God come, that hears all fantasy behind a matter babble in his ear, and walks out of his cosmic dream into the cosmic street, open mouth to the first consciousness. God's woke up now, you seraphim. Call every man with trumpet, microphone, and telegraph. Hail every sleepwalker with holy name. Life is waving. The cosmos is sending a message to itself. Its image is reproduced endlessly over TV, over the radio. The babble of Hitler's and Claudette Colbert's voices got mixed up in the bathroom radiator. Hello, hello, are you the telephone? The operator's singing, we are the daughters of the universe. Get everybody on the line at once. Plug in all ears in being by loudspeaker, newspeak, secret message, handwritten electronic impulse traveling along Ray's electric spiderweb, magnetism shuddering on one note, we, mustached disc jockeys trembling in mantric excitement, flowery patterns bursting over the broken couch, drapes falling to the floor in Saint-Jean-Perce's penthouse. Portugal's water is running in all the faucets on the SS Santa Rosa. Chopping machines descend on the pre-dawn tabloid. The wire services are hysterical and send too much message. They're waiting to bam out the Armageddon. Millions of rats reported in China. Smoke billows out of New York hospitals' furnace smokestack. I am writing millions of letters a year. I correspond with hopeful messengers in Detroit. I am taking drugs and leap at the postman for more correspondence. Man is leaving the earth in a rocket ship. There is a mutation of the race. We are no longer human beings. We are one being. We are being connected to itself. It makes me cross-eyed to think how the mass media assemble themselves like Congolese ants for a purpose. In the massive clay mound, an undiscovered huge queen is born. Africa wakes to redeem the old cosmos. I am masturbating in my bed. I dreamed a new stranger touched my heart with his eye. He hides in a loft side street in Hoboken. The heavens have covered East 2nd Street with snow. All day I walk in the wilderness over white carpets of city. We are redeeming ourselves. I am born. The Messiah is awoke in the universe. I announce the new nation in every mind. Take power over dead creation. I am naked in New York. A star breaks through the blue skull of the sky out the window. I seize the tablets of the law. The spectral Buddha and the spectral Christ turn to a stick of shit in the void. A fearful idea. I take the crown of the idea and place it on my head and sit a king among the reptile devas of my karma. I in every forehead sleeping waxy and the light gone inward to dream of fearful Yahweh or the atom bomb. All these eternal spirits to be wakened, all these bodies touched and healed, all these lack love, suffering, the hate, dumbed under the rainbows of creation. Oh, psychiatrist, the means of heaven at hand, thy rocks and my rocks are nothing. The identity of the moon is the identity of the flower thief. I and the police are one in revolutionary numbness. York, mercy, the octopus, it cometh over the void and makes whistle its lone-mouthed flute, you me, forever. Stop arguing, Cosmos. I give up, so I receive a happy letter from Ray Bremser, exiled home in Jersey jail. Clocks are a building for 1,000 years, ticking behind metalloid-esque electronico-clankered industries, smokeless and silent mind city. Dawn of the ages, man, thy alarm rings in sweet myriad mornings through every desperate card street. Saints wait in each metropolis for message to assassinate the old idea, that 2,000-year-old I-God man thought was being, secret mystery, unbearable God above, Yahweh alien, handless, tongueless to poor man who screamed for mercy on his deathbed. Oh, I saw that black octopus, death, with supernatural antennae spikes raying awful waves at my consciousness. Huge blind ball invisible behind the rooms in the universe. Not a man, a no one, nobodaddy. Omnipotent telepath, more visionary than my own prophetics and memories. Reptile, sentient, shimmer, feel whole here, dense soullessness, wiser than time, the eater, darkness, hungry for all, but must wait till I leave my body to enter that one mind nebula to my recollection, implacable, my soul dared not die, shrank back from the leprous door mind in his breast, touch him and the hands destroyed, death god in the end, before the time world of creation. I mean, some kind of monster from another dimension is eating beings of our cosmos. I saw him try to make me leave my corpse illusion Alan, myth movie world come to celluloid end. I screamed, seeing myself in reels of death, my consciousness a cinematic toy played once in faded attic by man already forgotten, his orphan starhood inked from space, the movie industry itself blot up its history and all racked myriad epics, space wiped itself out, lost in a wall-cracked dream itself had once disappearing, maybe trailing endless comet-long, trackless through what unwanted dimensions it keeps dreaming existence can die inside of. Vanish this cosmos of stars I am turning to bones in. That much illusion, and what's visions but visions? And these words-filled methadrine. I have a backache, and 2 telegrams come from midnight messengers that cry to plug in the electrode ear to my skull down street and hear what they got to say. Big lives like trees of cancer in Bronx and Long Island. Telephones connect the void's island, blissy darkness scattered in many man minds.
We would like at this time to invite the audience to ask questions or make some short, pointed comments that would evoke some stimulus in us. Is there anybody with a question or a comment? Something that you'd like to hear the panel talk about? Could you get up?
If any of us know anything about what? Gurdjieff? Gurdjieff.
I'm acquainted with Gurdjieff, but I'd like to know what you are interested in and how you relate his ideas with what we're talking about. But there's a microphone there.
In particular, I remember Gurdjieff talking about first of all, the fact that man is in a state of sleep, most men, all the time, and that essentially organic life is simply a means of feeding the earth, essentially, or acting as some kind of medium between dimensions, and that the final result of this is the growth of in our environment, the moon. And then he speaks of the development of a will in man, and eventually what might be called the transcendence of the human state of sleep, death, and the process of feeding the lower intervals.
Gurdjieff shares with all the enlightened ones and the philosophies or conceptions of the world left behind them the notion that what we call normal man is all wrong. In this particular view, the stress is in the condition of sleep, that is, lack of consciousness. This idea of sleep versus awakening recurs in all schools. Buddha, the word itself means awakened. And naturally the way is a way of developing consciousness, and what can we become conscious of? What we are unconscious of at the moment. Now this can be a very practical matter. Gurdjieff himself is reported to have criticized his students by trying to be conscious of remote things rather than being conscious of how they tie their shoes in the morning. Because consciousness is a very big word, but what we have in our hands is the development of attention. And this particular approach is very marked by the exercising of awareness to immediate experience. And how I would, the connection, one of the many connections between this conception to the issue of psychosis is that of psychosis being like this genius inside the bottle, and the story of the Arabian Nights, when the fisherman gets a bottle from the sea and opens it up, and inside is a jinn and one of genius, and that can we all have bottled up powers that eventually can be used, or if we open the bottle prematurely or it breaks when we're not expecting it, or we rub the lamp, and according to one or other of his stories, this tremendous power can use it for its ends.
I'd like to Mr. Watts, because I'm hung up over a point in my mind, which is does one exist, or does one
wave one's hand?
Well, could I hear any comments on any opinions about Gurdjieff?
Gurdjieff was a magnificent old rascal who lived a joyous life, and most of his disciples lived extremely restricted, rigid, and serious lives, because the object of Gurdjieff's method was to weed out those who understood from those who do not. And those who understood went away, and those who did not understand remained. Gurdjieff laid a trap for people who think that the purpose of life is power. That is to say, to control everything. And he beguiled them with the idea that they were all asleep and not fully in control of their own processes and their own organisms. And he assigned them the impossible task of being the Lord God Jehovah, each for oneself. He set them to doing this with great rigor, and he added to this the discipline of dances, in which you could exercise every limb working on a different rhythm to give yourself the illusion of this sort of omnipotence. But if you persevered in these exercises hard enough, you would discover that they were all nonsense, at which point you would have attained Mr. Gurdjieff's stage of illumination.
Thank you.
Watts's comments on Gurdjieff prompted me to inquire of perhaps a similar commentary on the Subud phenomenon, and especially since some people were talking about phenomenon of psychosis tonight and how it appears in different ways, and some people have compared the exercise in Subud to a simulated psychosis.
If I may comment on Subud, I can only do so at second hand. Lots of my friends joined Subud, but I, as one who is a temperamental non-joiner, don't have any direct experience of it. But I must say that those of my intimate friends who did participate in the Latihan seem to have derived certain benefits therefrom. If in case any of you don't know about it, I don't think I should take too long on this, but it has some relationship to what we're talking about. There was a mystical experience for an Indonesian gentleman by the name of Pak Subu, who could pass it on to others by opening them. And to open someone else, you tell them they're open, and that they must from then on regard themselves as being moved by a power within themselves but beyond themselves, which by its spontaneous wisdom would direct them in the path of the great life. And this they endeavored to increase by an exercise called the Latihan, lasting for about half an hour, in which men in one room and women in another, everybody was moved to do exactly what they felt inclined to do, provided they did each other no harm, and they then proceeded to feel what their organisms wanted to do under the guidance of the Spirit, and they would sometimes do nothing at all, sometimes they would roll in somersaults, sometimes they would chant, blather, and exercise themselves in a completely spontaneous and irrational way. A certain amount of this is of enormous benefit to everybody, because it is on the principle of the book of Genesis. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all that thou hast to do, but the seventh day thou shalt keep holiday. And so for 6 days, or for 6 parts of one's life, one should be sane and rational and follow the society game. But in order to do that, everybody needs a carnival. Carnivale, farewell to the concerns of the flesh. Farewell to rationality and let off steam. Our culture does not at present provide for this, and it's a very serious mistake. Because just in the same way that the Golden Gate Bridge is constructed to have flexibility so that it will swing in the wind, for that reason it remains intact. But if the Golden Gate Bridge were completely rigid, every time there was a strong wind it would collapse. So it is the same with people who are rigidly sane all the time and always try to keep their thoughts in order. They become extreme prey to very dangerous kinds of psychosis. But if you will please be sure to go crazy for at least half an hour a day, you will be sane. And so everybody should allow themselves a certain space to and they'll be all right.
I appreciate your comments, considering, as you said, that it was based on second-hand information, and I wonder if Allen Ginsberg, having had the first-hand information, would care to comment.
I have very little first-hand information. I'm a member of Subud. I've been opened and I've been at Latahans. But I only, after having spent 3 weeks or so outside the door in order to get my Subud card and attending the first Latahans, I didn't return due to the pressure of other business. So I don't know what went on after that.
I have a rather clinical question. Since this kind of seminar is on the validity of the psychotic experience, I can say that I kind of believe in the validity of the psychotic experience. But I'm curious as if to wonder, is there, I know there's a great being done by Mr. Lang, who's not here, at the Tavistock Institute, and I was wondering, has there been much success with chronic schizophrenics? Not just people that, go psychotic for a short period of time.
I think two of us should answer that maybe, because one is of the past and one is of the future. I have worked with people in schizophrenic breaks for a good many years, part-time. Most of my time is spent as an analyst, but I do have an interest in this for the very reason that it does seem to me there's a kind of vogue nowadays not to listen to the patient anymore. The patient comes in with trouble, and the first thing you do is snow it under with as much medication as you can and obliterate the patient's experience and try to yank them back to where they've been before they came in, which is too bad because that wasn't quite so good. That's why they had a break. And over the years, I found that, yes, that can be considerable change through the psychotic experience and change for the better. But it's a lot of very hard work, and the part of this that belongs to the future, which I think Julian should also talk about, is that I think if you set up proper hospital conditions, where this condition is not considered just things gone wrong only, but where you have a whole atmosphere on the part of a hospital staff of acknowledgement of the validity of this thing, it makes a difference to the patient. As I was mentioning before, part of the difficulty is this profound feeling of being isolated and down inside one's own experience that cannot be at all communicated with anybody else or made clear to anybody else so that they can respond to it. And if you have a staff that are not necessarily psychiatric, perhaps even preferably not, but people who've been there, who have a feeling for it and who can kind of tune in on it intuitively, chances are the thing might go very differently. Because in individual cases, I know, in spite of the hospital atmosphere, if there is someone around who does participate and empathize and listen and really come into close connection with that experience, the thing does go quite well. In the short run at least. Then, of course, there are many hazards afterward as to what becomes of that experience once they leave the atmosphere of that relationship. But Julian might give a word or two as to some plans we have for that kind of project.
John Perry is one of a number of gifted clinicians who's written about people who've gone through psychotic experiences and recovered in a fashion that allowed them to do things emotionally and psychologically they were unable to do before they became so-called mentally ill. Apparently, also some clinicians who've had both first-hand experience and treated a number of psychotics report in very intense and powerful terms the nature of the psychotic experience as a healing process, something that has to be gone through, not aborted. These facts and also the first-hand reports by people who say, I've gone there, I've been there, I've come back, I don't want to ever go there again, but it's good that I went there. Now these are facts, these are data that we have to grapple with as people who are dealing with treating. We're treating people by cutting that thing off. See, now it may be we're cutting that thing off in a large number of people who not ought to be cut off in. And some of the things we're planning have to do with allowing this process to go on in a safe atmosphere. You see, you just can't go mad down whatever the street is out here and expect, if you're a public nuisance, to get away with it. But if you have an environment in which this process can unfold in a way that doesn't disturb anybody except the people in your immediate vicinity, and they're with you, they accept the nature of the importance of what's going on, well, then we have a feeling that we can really help these people get through something that will make them, as Carl Menninger said, weller than before. And that's what we're about. Also, in people who go through a rotten life, it's very interesting that the incidence of schizophrenia in the lowest classes in our society is much higher. Prevalence rates are much higher. People who go through severe emotional disturbances, who lose their jobs, who don't function effectively for one reason or another, seem to be more prone, if they're so built, to go through this experience. So that the psychosis serves another function besides a problem-solving venture. It also protects them from an environment, that kind of an environment, that's totally oppressive, truly unpleasant. Lang, in his book, The Politics of Experience, is writing about a conversation between two psychotics, which is absolutely the farthest out thing you've ever heard. One guy's talking that way and the other guy's talking that way. And they're talking to each other, but they're not talking to each other. Anyway, he says it like this. He's talking about Smith and Jones. To regard the gambits of Smith and Jones as due primarily to some psychological deficit is rather like supposing that a man doing a handstand on a bicycle on a tightrope 100 feet up with no safety net is suffering from an inability to stand on his own 2 feet. We may well ask why these people have to be, often brilliantly, so devious, so elusive, so adept at making themselves unremittingly incomprehensible.
I've learned recently of of Scientology, and as I understand it, the idea is to cure an insane planet with a very precise method, steps towards clearing an individual. And the Scientologists I've talked to have no doubt that they can save the world through this method, and that the normal person is in fact very neurotic. I'd like to hear if any of you have any experience with Scientology or what you think of it.
Yeah, I have no direct experience with it except through Burroughs, who was involved, William Burroughs in London, who was involved with it for the last 6 or 7 years, at first theoretically, and now apparently involved directly with the whatever organization there is in London. He's written a very intelligent pamphlet on it, which I think the Scientology groups are circulating. Basic theory is that if you will get up and repeat, sit down and repeat over and over again the images to which you are attached, through repeating them several dozen times and having them played back or fed back to you, a feedback is set up which after a while eliminates the obsessive affect connected with the imagery, so that after a while you begin to look at it objectively or without compulsive affect or without hysterical affect. Burroughs at the moment swears by it as a method of clarifying sensory consciousness. And so I think in the way he's using it, or the way he's interpreting it, or perhaps the way it's actually being practiced in England, it may be a very useful mechanism.
It was announced in the San Francisco Chronicle today that 2 American students of Scientology were not allowed to enter Great Britain by the immigration authorities.
Probably they didn't have enough. They didn't display enough affect in relation to the uniforms they were, the images of the uniforms or the flags they were confronted with.
On the left backside of a baby cockroach, there stood a queen bee in her tiny amber coach. He walked a mile to make her smile. Oh, that crazy, lazy, black baby cockroach. Richard L. Galliot. Question. Has anyone ever actually proven that reality exists?
Thrummula, thrummula, thrilp, come lipsible, lipsible, lilp, dim thricken me thrummil am gumpulus gummy, storm gurgle am bumbula bilp.
Yeah, there's a funny kind of confusion here. It's as if most of the panelists were talking to an audience of solid, citizenly believing psychiatrists instead of what I presume it is, a number of people who consider themselves schizophrenic, psychotic, but viably so. So how many here actually consider yourselves viably psychotic? Will you raise your hands? Or who have had psychotic experiences or are in the present state? And how many consider themselves like completely normally sane and like not to be categorized? Is there anybody that... Yeah, well, what I mean is that the tone or affect of most of the addresses here have been as if it were not recognized that we are all in a conspiracy together to manifest the experiences that we have had as being more real than that which is taken to be sanity by the official sane makers. And I think one problem with Dr. Perry's address was that he was still referring to this deplorable condition that we are all suffering as if sympathetically, but still hiding his light in a bushel.
I'd like to ask a few questions. I'd like to ask Mr. Ginsburg about possibly the difference between re-educating old ideas and assassinating them. And I'd like to ask Mr. Watts about what he means by too much religion. I don't know what I'm saying about the age. Should I stop?
Say Aum, it'll stop.
Aum?
It cuts feedback sometimes.
That always reminds me of the first part of Eddie Fisher's song, or something, Om My Papa, or something like that. I mean, I can never tell one of those songs from the other, unless one's sponsored by Coca-Cola, I guess. But I'd also like to ask about methadone, like if there's no dangers in that, and what the dangers of that are. I don't know. If I ask any more the difference between Om and Oh My Papa than methadone and Coca-Cola.
Okay, well, the question was the difference between assassinating ideas and
educating.
Also, dangers of methadone.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Speed kills. That was one weekend of methadone. I really am almost sorry to have the word in the poem lest it lead tender and immature bodies to terrible consequences, because I think that methadone is a serious plague on consciousness at the moment, or on bodies at the moment. So it's a big bring down, as it's used continually. Yes, obviously it's a big drag. As for re-educating versus assassination in terms of the old idea of Yahweh, what I'm finding as with this particular incident, taking the methadone for a weekend, that being methadone combined with some heroin, combined with some psilocybin, actually, not just methadone, plus some benzodrine pills, and several days writing continuously. What I find myself doing is going into situations, either catalyzed by drugs or without drugs, in which there is a more radiant consciousness, a flip out or psychotic experience, or as Greta Bebering, who's an old Freudian, would described it as a disintegration of the ego and descent into the id. But I always find that I wind up reintegrating or returning to normal, as this specimen poem did, slightly altered, so that I find the best upaya, or most skillful means for dealing with the unconscious, is to go take a bath in it, distrust all conclusions, come back with whatever is usable and not insist on anything. So that would eliminate Siran assassination style.
I understand. First, I understand if you said reiterating or reiterating. Was that
integrating?
IT or ID?
Reintegrating. She said, she being a sweet old lady who was analyzed by Freud.
Well, I always thought it was a pun on id, but it wasn't, right?
No, I wasn't thinking that fast.
Well, right at that point, I didn't understand from there on.
Understand what?
Except for the bath. I understood something about a bath, but
I haven't bathed in days. I'm at a loss.
I didn't understand that either.
I haven't taken acid for a year. I'm at a loss.
Well,
you had a question or what?
Yeah, some of you have touched on poetry and music as expressions of altered states of consciousness. And I'd like to reverse. Maybe you know I can use dance, chant, playing music as ways to alter my consciousness, but I don't know, except for listening to Alan recite, ways of using poetry to change the way that I'm experiencing the world. Maybe you have ways of using poetry or language that put you through changes. And whether you want to answer that by describing what you do or doing it, I don't care. But what sort of things do you know about, or what have you done?
Is that to me?
Yeah, you or anybody else who feels moved.
I'll give a short. The classical thing is that John Stuart Mill said that after a period of Great Depression, after he had read Wordsworth, or during a reading of Wordsworth, he suddenly had a very fantastic experience by the ocean and began a new life. Incipit vita nuova for him as a result of language. I had a similar experience with Blake. George Barker also reported a similar experience with various poems of Blake. A lot of people report that of my poetry, oddly, from Arkansas. It's an old experience that apparently certain linkings of sounds, plus concomitantly, possibly, the breathing necessary for pronunciation of those sounds, plus the concomitant associational electrical discharges in the brain, can apparently catalyze an altered metabolism and an alteration of consciousness through little lyrics, short as Blake's Sick Rose or Sunflower, or longer through long shamanistic chant type poems such as Dylan Thomas's or Hart Crane's Atlantis. Or say specifically Shelley, if one were to pronounce the Ode to the West Wind, paying careful attention to where the commas fell, where the breath stops fell, and pronounced the lines as they came out, not stopping until there was a comma or a definite breath stop, you'll find that your breathing is altered and your consciousness is altered. So there's a secret machine, a physiological machine involved with poetry. that comes in, like, unless you're aware of it, it's secret.
I'd like to ask Dr. Perry if he would draw any lines between the use of LSD and schizophrenia.
In the, let's see, you mean in the experimental use of LSD, or sorry to bring you all the way back. I'm not, good.
I thought perhaps as a psychiatrist and having dealt with psychotic experiences in LSD.
You're really asking the wrong guy, because I haven't myself worked with LSD, and I'm not very familiar with it. My work has been entirely in the spontaneous break, the spontaneous episode that comes up in young adults.
Possibly, would any of the few cases that have come, that you have come into contact with, would you have labeled them schizophrenic?
People who have had the drug and have had this opening experience? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, had the drug.
No, I have not had any of my own patients go through that. It does happen, but I think the ones to whom it happens are ones who are pretty close to an episode anyway. They're living very close to the borderline. There are tendencies to drop over into a schizophrenic episode, and then I think, yes, the drug can do that. I think you, Dr. Naranjo, would be much more informed about this than I. Do you want to take that one?
Well, it's a fact that there is, within the variety of LSD reactions, there is the possibility of states that are quite similar to schizophrenic syndromes. In normal conditions, that is a great minority. Aside from that reaction to an isolated LSD experience, there is this fact reported by Dr. Groff of the progressive deepening. He says that in a course of 80 successive sessions once a week, in his experience in Czechoslovakia went, people normally would improve by ordinary standards during a period, and then go down till everybody wanted to quit, whether it was the people in their own staff or these neurotic patients or the psychotic ones, but they were pushed or convinced to follow on the basis of their own conviction and the good outcome. And he says that by around the 40th to 60th session, portion of people, when they had this first contact with the archetypal world, he says all these rebirth experiences and mythical experiences of the first LSD reactions are only a pale shadow of the real thing by this stage, and then it's once and for all complete restructuring of personality. And people who have initially psychosis and have improved throughout the 40 or 60 LSD sessions go back to their original psychosis for some weeks and before the final improvement. And but not only psychotics, but other people can have that period too. Now, this is, I think there's nothing specific to LSD. LSD is an accelerator, enhancer, but also in ordinary psychoanalytic treatment, especially in the Melanie Klein School in England, there's great insistence in the final stages, sometimes in a successful analysis within the 6th year probably, people have psychotic experiences within the context of the treatment, people who have never had this hallucinations or this kind of reaction in their lives.
There have been cases reported of people who've had LSD and subsequently been psychotic or vice versa, and these reports suggest that during the height of an LSD experience and in the throes of a psychotic episode, there's essentially no distinction that can be made by the person going through these experiences. In our work using a variety of laboratory procedures, neurological procedures, we find that at least for certain kinds of schizophrenic experiences, the behavior patterns they show are identical, as far as we can make out, to the behavior patterns, the EEG behavior patterns, sensory behavior patterns of people going through LSD experiences on small or large dosages. What gets you into trouble is the idea that we're dealing with sickness on the one hand and some kind of a miraculous drug on the other, and that these two things, that the sickness thing casts aspersions on the use of LSD, or people who use LSD. I think that the process is the same. It appears to be the same neurologically, and from people's reports, it's essentially the same subjectively. When you're out of your head, you're out of your head. You're in touch with something else. You're not here, or something.
I'd like to ask a question about, the American flag there, and people coming here and speaking under the American flag that's murdering people, generally right and left, and people coming here to contribute $1, $2, $3 these $3 war bonds that the United States Army puts out in order to support this effort. And I wonder why individuals of this sort would consider people who might have made communications with other planets, not myself, but the possibility that they might, to consider these individuals psychotic when very individuals themselves are contributing either through these war bonds with George Washington's picture on them, or something similar to what might be possibly a psychotic episode.
May I address myself to that? I think this question again, as I was saying, the word is upaya, skillful means. This convocation, as far as I understand, was conjured up in order to validate the rightness of insanity. That insanity was actually sanity, and so to show that that it was really more true than the thinner consciousness of everyday life. So it was considered skillful means to wrap ourselves in the flag in order to propose insanity to the nation. That was all. So that people wouldn't get scared. They would think it was patriotic, so therefore it would be okay. It's done under the auspices of a tax-exempt foundation, so no money of the evening is going to pay the government for the war. So I don't think there's any actual problem.
What about the basic essence of what's the difference between a $20 bill and a Series E war bond?
Well, you're calling money itself into question, not merely the flag.
Well, I was thinking of it. I don't know if I was all by myself.
Well, that I don't know. I'm not getting any money for this, but so you have to ask the excellent Big Sur people.
Oh, I'm asking a question, not for a money bank. Excuse me.
I called, the people that were moving ahead of you. No, I just.
Pick the maddest.
Yeah, let's pick the toughest one and get him. Come on.
Well, Marshall McLuhan said that something like the natural condition of man is schizophrenic. Well, what if it is?
I'll have to bring my light out from under that bushel you're talking about, I guess. No, I do object to that. I don't remember saying that, frankly, but still, I think, no, this is not the natural condition. It seems to me that yes, we have schizophrenia in us, if by schizophrenia you mean we have this totally other way of looking at our world and experiencing things. That we have. And there is a right place for it, which is that we keep it behind an ego which needs to cope. And we can't have that unconscious continually enveloping us all the time, because then we can't deal with the world clearly. We have to be able to drop in and out.
I'm sorry.
So I'm in favor of normalcy, sanity, or whatever you like, in order to be effective. I think it's fun to be effective in the world. I like to have an ego. I enjoy it. And I like to be able to do the things I want to do, and I find it intensely interesting. And then I also like to drop sit back and have my dreams, you know. Both can be there, it seems to me. But this isn't schizophrenia.
I'm sorry, because I could hardly
Maybe
hear.
I didn't
could
understand.
hardly hear what you were saying after you said no, it wasn't schizophrenic. I mean, I feel that if Marshall McLuhan was here, then there'd be quite a debate going. I mean, Marshall McLuhan wouldn't settle for a no. I mean, he'd want to talk about it and say something like, how do you know the natural condition of man isn't schizophrenic?
The word schizophrenia, as a matter of fact, is one of the most ill-defined terms in psychiatry. We use it popularly in quite another way than it is generally employed in psychiatry, which means split-mindedness. And one could say that the human race is split-minded in the sense that it is preoccupied, insofar as it is civilized, with forcing the world of nature to conform to the rules of its linguistic logics. It is confused between reality, and everybody knows what reality is, and the symbols of reality, which we call ideas, words, and so forth. And so, in that sense, there is a very grave split between the world we think we live in and the world we live in, as exemplified by, for example, by the fact that an enormous number of businessmen read the Wall Street Journal but omit the first page. That is to say, their understanding of what is happening in the world of business is entirely in terms of mathematical tables as to the statistics of the market. This report of the goings-on in the world completely eliminates all sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and textures. Furthermore, the Congress recently passed a law against burning the American flag. These same congressmen, with all the patriotic fervor which they put into passing this law, are responsible for burning, by acts of commission and omission, that for which the flag stands, namely the physical and biological entity called the United States of America. Because we are in that sense completely confused as between words and what they mean. We eat bread, which is theoretical bread and has chemical formulae on the wrapper, but tastes of no bread known to good cooks throughout the earth. Now, in this sort of predicament, the poet introduces an essential sanity by using language in a musical and non-logical way, and by taking us, by his incantation, his enchantment, forces us to go out of our minds that we may come to our senses. This was always the art of Orpheus. It was the art of David when he played the harp before the insane Saul, because Saul, ambitious of the kingship, was therefore a power-mad man, and the musician calls him back to participate in the world rather than attempt to dominate it. A man who confuses his organism with his verbal symbol of himself, which may be his name, his role, his status, is a man who is beside himself. And that is the strict meaning of the term paranoia. And as Ananda Kumaraswamy said, you must choose between paranoia or metanoia. Metanoia, which is misleadingly translated repentance, is actually to get with yourself. Get with it, baby. Like that. And therefore to experience the fact that he is an integral part of the natural universe. The poet does this, though, by using language in a way that transcends language, by often playing on the ungraspability of things, or the sheer insanity of things, as in Shakespeare, when he says that all of life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. And as R.H. Blythe commented, said so well, it doesn't seem so bad after all. So our revels now are ended, and these our actors, as I foretold you, are all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air.
And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, I, all which it inherits, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. So it was all nonsense, but how beautiful.
I was wondering about I heard some things about inducing psychotic experience, and I was wondering, like, how do you know that whether it's a good idea to induce a psychotic experience? I mean, how do you know that it's going to be beneficial? I mean, how can you be sure that it might not be something else?
We are talking about a disorder of mind, which is not something that we want to induce, but something we want to deal with in a more sensible way than it's currently being dealt with in most of our state institutions around the country.
And the tendency of the conversation was toward the fact that it was not necessarily a disorder, but another order.
Yeah. We don't want to induce it. We want to respond to it in a more sensible way. That's what we've been talking about tonight. That's what we've been talking about all month in these series of workshops and seminars.
Well, what would you say would be a sensible way to respond to psychotic experience?
The psychotic experience is nature's way of trying to set something straight that has been in trouble. And it picks its own place, its own time, its own right conditions to happen. And I believe in nature pretty much, and I feel the psyche knows what it's doing. And then I like to respond to that. But I certainly wouldn't want to interfere, and by notions that I might have, that somebody's in need of a psychosis, try to bring it on. I think that then the thing is to respond, to enter into a relationship with the psychosis. That's the essence of it. The psychotic person needs a friend, needs somebody across the room to whom he can say these things, convey these experiences, and hence unify them. And this we call the transference. It's a very intense emotional relationship that builds between two persons. And this compacts the experience, makes it safe, makes it plausible, and makes it communicable, and then you find a progress coming through the whole process of the psychosis.
The most common psychotic experience is falling in love.
Yeah.
And while to fall in love is one of the most fantastic experiences in life, there is absolutely no method and no school which can teach people how to fall in love. You fall in love in the same way as you grow ears, and there is no school for growing ears. But if you're lucky and you're human, you have ears, and if you're lucky and you're human, in the course of life you undergo the experience of falling in love, and when it happens it's unmistakable and tremendous, and you see in a very ordinary woman an incarnation of the goddess. The question is, you are certainly not sane when you see this, because she is just an ordinary girl. But actually the veils have been taken from your eyes, or the scales, I should say, have been taken from your eyes, and you have seen one human being as in fact they really are. But you're of course quite mad. And all inspired vision of poetry, of drama, of dancing, and of music is a certain kind of madness. But there is madness and madness, just as there is a difference between nonsense and bunk.
What's the difference?
The difference is this. When you look at the shape of a cloud, you may, as an artist, copy it, although it has no meaning. And everybody acknowledges that there is some kind of order in it, although it is not symmetrical. A cloud is not Euclidean. It doesn't form into nice geometrical patterns. It is profoundly and essentially wiggly. But everybody recognizes that it has some extraordinary quality of beauty in it. And therefore it is nonsense, but it is not bunk. On the other hand, bunk, as we might say, the contents of a garbage can, is not something enormously interesting unless you are a completely inspired photographer, and you light that garbage and frame it in such a way that you bring out the inherent beauty in it, and therefore, as an artist, you translate bunk into nonsense.
Well, if you know a man by his possessions, do you think you might also be able to know a man or a person by what he throws away?
Absolutely.
Well, then would you say...
Because you can
garbage
always
is
distinguish
garbage?
different nationalities by the smells of their excrements.
Uh-huh.
Can we have another question, please? Another questioner? No, there's someone behind you. Yeah.
I'd like to ask Dr. Naranjo about the shaman and whether we might consider the shaman the archetype of the, say, modern-day psychotic, and whether we could consider the shaman or the psychotic as a harbinger, perhaps, of new creative experience or new ways of experiencing spiritual or a creative life, or as a retrograde, someone who is actually expressing a nervous breakdown. It's like, I don't know if you fully understand that the way I presented it, but...
First question is about the relationship between a shaman and a psychiatrist.
The shaman and the psychotic.
And the psychotic.
Right.
Well, in many of the accounts we have of shamanistic experiences, one of the main elements in them, which is the possession by spirits that become wise guides, this is at first encountered as an accident in their way, and as something that it's causing them suffering, and even among them is regarded as illness. So in those terms, a shaman is a cured psychotic, but not cured in the terms that we regard the outcome of the process of healing, like doing away, but rather integrating two worlds. And the way of integrating the psychotic, quotes, world into his reality of the shaman is the exercise of his own profession, because his own way of healing others entails summoning up this kind of experience, which was originally for him the illness. In fact, a shaman generally goes ill when he can't perform. Eskimo shamans, for instance, are said to lose their even physical strength and become depressed when they can't go through the ceremonies that entail their going into trances and singing and so on. Probably it's not too different from what would happen to anybody who does not do his thing, whatever his vocation is. But here it has the implication of needing this seventh day about which Alan Watts was telling us, his surrender to his own nature. So it seems that the process seems to be one of the contacting our other half, the suppressed part of our own experience. The shaman contacts this experience in a way that at first it clashes, but finally is allowed to grow into one thing with the conscious life, whereas the psychotic stays in one world, the normal, in quotes, stays in the other. We are amputated of our underworld, and the psychotic is amputated of his overworld.
I feel like you've given us a description of a shaman, but I still don't feel like you've answered the basic question of mine, which is that rather causality. What causes the shaman? What is he derived from an adverse situation in his environment, or is he a super-sensitive individual with an inborn artistic nature? And how would we relate this to the modern-day psychotic and his relationship with the shaman?
There are many factors entailed here, and they are taken into account by different cultures in different ways. In some places, the shaman is chosen, in their way of putting it, chosen by the spirits. So there's a completely spontaneous process, whereas in other cultures, they allow for either the spontaneous process or being chosen by the older shamans who can say this man who has the potential, so they elicit this experience. And finally, in other cultures, there's a third possibility of the person himself choosing. But the way of the three types of shamans is different. For instance, in Australia, the tradition allows for the three ways of becoming a shaman, but the person who is chosen by the spirits is at once recognized by the elder shamans and says, well, he's a shaman already. He undergoes instruction, but he's essentially has had his initiative experience is acknowledged, recognized. Whereas the person who chooses to be a shaman undergoes the most painful ordeals, like being thorns are introduced under his nails, his tongue is perforated, he undergoes long periods of deprivation of social contact, isolation, his skin is rubbed with rough materials that practically leaves a big wound over his body and so on. So I think this is an implicit acknowledgement that whenever the process does not occur spontaneously, a lot of artificial means are needed to bring about the same effect.
Okay. I'd like to direct a question to Mr. Alan Watts. I actually agree with everything Alan Watts says. I mean, I've read a lot of his books, and he makes it sound so simple from a philosopher's point of view, but I still like to ask him, like, how do you do it?
That's the wrong question. It reminds me of the famous story of the American tourist in England who asked the way to Upper Tuddenham from a local yokel, who scratched his head and replied, "Well, sir, maybe I do know where it is, but if I were you, I wouldn't start from here." The only answer I can give to the question, how do you do it, is find out why you want to, and then you'll know the answer.
Last question.
If I'll address it to Dr. Naranjo, because I think you, in the first, directed the definition of, say, psychotic as a person who is totally overwhelmed by this expanding consciousness experience, and say a normal person is a person who masks this experience and covers it away in the daily rites of whatever he does, and then an artist as a person who's coping with it, dealing with it, involved with it. Well, if it's on the same level that an artist has a very similar experience to, say, a psychotic person, if there is such a thing, why is the artist coping and the schizophrenic not? What makes the difference? And anyone else who can elaborate that?
Ronald, Dr. Lang, who is not here, has spoken to this point by playing upon the two meanings of the statement, "There is nothing to be afraid of." The psychotic experiences, there is nothing to be afraid of. The man who has gone through his psychosis copes with reality, whatever it is, rather stresses that there is nothing to be afraid of. So I think the answer is essentially illusory fear of contact with reality, whatever it is. The transitional phases of this have been described by Sartre very expressively by images like stressing the impinging of a reality that's too much to bear, or to the threat of being dissolved, or the threat of whatever is out there, and the existentialists are very pessimistic about there being anything beyond this. Either you are in bad faith, or you face this reality that will paying the price of anxiety for the rest of your life. I assume that there is an alternative possibility of the successful, creative person who finally finds out that breaks through this paranoid thought I was talking about, that can have the most appealing forms of expression, but after all it's not true anyhow, because everything is all right. I think there's a basic assumption that's buried in all of us, that things are wrong, and the real end of psychosis, which can be achieved only through going to the depth of it, is finding out that that was a mistake and a wrong assumption.
Then how can the artist who is say, expansive consciousness as for the psychotic as opposed to expanded for the artist, how can the artist help the psychotic deal with this reality? What are the distinctions that he's making? How can we use the experience of an artist, since he's so totally involved also in helping someone who's also totally involved?
The obvious way would be for artists to conspire to redefine reality and to manifest an expanded sense of reality in such a way as it's socially communicable, in such a way as it can be also articulated in social forms so that everybody can agree on it, so that actually people who are having expansions of consciousness which are defined socially as psychotic or sick or wrong or misinterpretations can find a place in a slightly looser sense of reality, or through the general hipness to the fact that reality is a matter of interpretation and a matter of admission of consciousness or interpretation of phenomena rather than the way things actually are. Once a psychotic understands that his insight is real, that it's just a matter of manifesting it in focus rather than pushing and insisting by violence on his insight, but of using proper upaya for articulating his awareness. Like, in other words, he thinks he's God, say. Well, of course he's God. Now, to go around or I thought I was God, so I ran around Columbia University telling Mark Van Doren and Lionel Trilling I was God in such a way as they got frightened, because I was telling them that in such a way as it would make them sound like they weren't. I didn't define it in such a way or articulate it in such a way as it included them in a way which didn't threaten their sense of their own being. Will push the boundaries of definition back for the society at large, or for those who can be tuned in, and create a larger and larger populace of communion or communication within a larger consciousness. So in other words, the helpfulness of the artistic manifestation is that people who think they are lonely nuts can realize that they're not alone, and that actually, as Artaud said, the official society is a giant conspiracy to suppress the awareness that we're all aware of, and which is called the unconscious, to the extent that people are put into a hypnotic sleep state so they won't be aware of what we all are actually aware of.
I think one important distinction that has to be drawn between the artist and the psychotic has to do with the difference in how come they're in that lower order referential state. The artist is one who seeks out these images, these forces. He seeks new forms in that non-rational sphere. Sullivan, on the other, points out...
It might not be such a good idea. I mean, that might be like a big compromise. In other words, it might be that from another point of view, someone who doesn't try to mediate between the different forms of language consciousness. So the artist is mediating between the different forms of image or language consciousness and playing like walking a fence and playing both sides, as I am, obviously, like when I read that poem. It might be that someone who is not attempting to compromise the insight is socially more valid in the long run, at least at this stage of our society.
But I think the primary definition of the problem in psychosis is that Sullivan talks about an attempt to cope with what is essentially a failure at being human, a failure at being anything that one could respect as worth being. And this is the thing that many clinicians have noted about the man in the throes of madness, in which he's engulfed, thrown into this space, and has not the wherewithal to deal with whatever he's swamped in, whereas the artist really is capable of more.
But what I'm saying is that what we're dealing with is the fact that we're not really human. I mean, that's just an arbitrary, proposition. I mean, I don't think anybody here accepts that really seriously.
Well, one thing that we really
find...
Are you human? One thing that I have to hold on to is my self-esteem. It seems to be that in psychosis I have none. And whatever that...
We're all too fucked up at this point to have any of that left, I think.
But, well, you've got enough for about 3 people, you know.
Not by that kind of trick, no.
Besides everything we've said tonight.
You know, I'm finally objecting to the use of the categories that the panel has proposed.
I'd like to offer a little bit to those categories.
To the pejorative use of the language, to begin with, in terms of the language, schizophrenia, psychosis. It seems to me obvious to everybody, almost everybody here, that what is called the psychotic experience is a large-scale experience of cosmic consciousness, that its interpretation socially sometimes gets fucked up from one side or the other, either the receiver or the sender, that it's a language difficulty, that there's impatience that gets involved. But basically it must be understood that what has been called all along the madness of psychotic experience is an experience of the great planetary consciousness, which is like so common among us today that it's ridiculous to talk in the old psychiatric terms. This is what Lang has been saying all along. This is what all of us really sort of basically agree on. But I don't see why we're still hanging on to that formalistic...
I think when Sullivan's speaking of humanness, maybe in this context we can speak of passionateness better. That the schizophrenic personality before the break has been afraid to be living the passionate kind of life, or to live in an impassioned world, because it isn't safe. And in the depths of his psychosis, he gets in touch with his passionateness, but it comes in images first. It's symbols, it's ideas floating by, it's a little vague. But if he brings it off, he gets in touch with what can be a passionate life for the first time. Where I think the artist, almost by definition, lives a passionate life. He's intensely involved, and he cares intensely to communicate his experience. So he starts at the different end of that scale.
I don't think there's that much difference. There's a question of there's like hundreds of cats on Haight-Ashbury, incapable of articulating socially what I'm articulating, who have a very definite, clear, passionate, very deep experience of anything I've experienced or anything we've experienced. The society has not yet changed enough to accommodate their lifestyle and their consciousness. I think the society will have to, in as much as the closed, limited consciousness in which the society is run is obviously self-destructive. I mean, it's destroying the whole organism. The enormous eruption of what are called psychotic or schizophrenic experiences is caused by that cracking down, that breakdown of the structure under its own weight. I think a passionate life, as was just defined, is lived by an enormous number of people. There need not necessarily be an articulation of it in artistic form. At this point, historically, I feel sort of like a hangover. like Alan Watts, mediating to the squares, or mediating to the so-called sane people.
Well, the ability to communicate that is a gift. It's a special talent for some people, but I think the cats you're speaking of are living at least in that impassioned kind of world, maybe. And that isn't the same as the schizophrenic state, then? Or the pre-schizophrenic state?
Schizophrenics I've known.
That's the next symposium.
I have been more impassioned than you or I think. in deeper states of passion than we're displaying now.
But as a result of getting in touch with it through their
even gibbering down the street, bopping away, screaming at the police, even like the most ratty-looking flower children on Haight-Ashbury are, in like a funny kind of excited contact with their immediate environment that we're not. I mean, that we haven't displayed toward the audience even.
But I think for me now, the problem is, how do I integrate what the value of psychotic experience is in such a way that I can make significant changes in the establishment's way of regarding madness, altered states of consciousness. And I think, to polarize it in such a way that there's no distinctions to be made prohibits me from doing anything as a scientist working in the field. And I can accept all the things you say, but then I don't know what to work with.
Well, belief in the ultimate value of the belief in one's own senses, in one's supersaturated senses or one's own unconscious senses, real self-confidence winds up giving a demeanor which is reassuring in the exercise of madness rather than dismaying. In other words, just go through your madness more cheerfully. And one of the problems of the psychiatric terminology is that it's not a cheerful enough approach to madness.
Thank you very much. Good night.